Good evening. Welcome to The View Up There. I'm your host, Canadian Glenn, and it is June 19th, 2019. Tonight, the last week of Parliament 42. What passes and what dies? Well, this is the last scheduled week of sitting for Canada's 42nd Parliament. Normally, the House will rise for summer recess, return for one day in early September for a motion of dissolution, after which the Prime Minister asked the Governor-General to dissolve the House and drop the Election Writ. However, this may not be a normal recess. The rush is on to pass legislation for Royal Assent before that election campaign can begin, and both the House and the Senate have extremely packed order papers. Now, the Senate is scheduled to sit an extra week compared to the House of Commons, which, depending on how things go down, could force a longer than one day return in September for the House and more than one motion. Negotiations on amendments and shuffling of papers from West Block to the Senate building and back is a hectic pace. How do topics from the last election campaign 4 years ago end up being rushed in the last week? Politics. But, let it be said, the 42nd Parliament sat the entire mandate in one session. No proroguements, no contempt of Parliament, no obvious subterfuge of proceedings for political leverage. So there is that. Kind of a refreshing return to normalcy. But then, no idiot speaker in either chamber this term either. What a coincidence. Environment, natural resources, public safety, justice, and Indigenous relations have the large majority of logjams trying to get done. Now, considering the disarray those portfolios were left in by the previous government, to a degree, it stands to reason they're the big holdups 4 years later. Or does it? Has the new freedom of the Senate made our system better or worse? The only remaining partisan caucus that is left in the Senate of Canada, the Conservatives, have gone from compliant lapdogs to opposition yapdogs. But their majority is a distant memory. The independent senators group now rules the roost. So what will make it to Royal Assent become law? What will die on the order paper? There is a lot of stuff. I mean, the information for this episode has been updated 3 hours ago. There is stuff moving. Go, go, go. And people who say that the Senate never does anything, well, they've done more in the last 72 hours than I can remember entire years. But everybody was expecting this. It's kind of a tradition. I would have to say, for my opinion, the Liberals are going to leave less undone that they started than the previous government, if you're keeping score. I'm going to go back to May 27th to start us, to give us the background. From the Hill Times, Peter Mazaru, House leaders keep each other in the dark as last push on legislation begins. So, of course, like I said, this is the last week of May. With just 4 weeks left before the House of Commons is scheduled to rise for the last time before the fall election, time allocation motions are stacking up in the House. The government is moving to make MPs work until midnight, and the government and Conservative House leaders each say a lack of information from the other is to blame for some of the acrimony and unpredictability that has become commonplace in the chamber. Now, in the last week of May, the government still had 20 active bills before Parliament, 8 in the House, 12 in the Senate, and 20 days left, unless they sit in July, after Canada Day. These include Bill C-98, to make good on a promise from Public Safety Minister Ralph Goodale to create an oversight body for Canada Border Services Agency. Well overdue. At this point, it was still at second reading in the House. Bill C-92 on Indigenous child welfare, and at that point was in front of the House Committee for Indigenous Affairs. Bill C-69, we know what that's about. At that point, we're still with the Senate Environment Committee. Well, that's definitely come along. And Bill C-71 on gun control reform, still in the Senate at third reading at that point. Government House Leader Bartosz Chagger told the House on May 16th that the Chamber would deal with bills returned from committee and the Senate in the coming week. Bill C-81 on accessibility and C-58 on access to information are currently before the House after coming back from the Senate with amendments. Well, then the government gave notice that a motion to extend the sitting hours in the House until midnight for the rest of the session would be debated. The House will sit until midnight on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday until the end of June. The House was also scheduled to spend time on that day in May debating Liberal MP Frank Baylis' private member's motion, M231, to change the standing orders in the House and take away some of the power party whips and House leaders hold over backbenchers. Yeah, it never fails to amaze me that all this stuff for taking power away from those in control, they all pop up the last, 8 weeks before there's a friggin' election? How to stand up, guys. Yeah, awesome. Many of the government's most high-profile bills are now before the Senate, but could come back to the House with amendments. They talk about the amendments for C-69, which there's no point talking about it now because it's history. Under an agreement signed by Senate group leaders, Bill C-83 and C-59 on national security were scheduled to be voted on at third reading in the Senate by May 30th. Now, Ms. Chagger told the Hill Times that she wanted all of the active bills before Parliament to be passed before the end of the session. We're going to keep legislation moving. The opposition has a choice whether we move it along in a more productive way or if the government has to use the limited tools available. And then, of course, we get, your standard "we're better than they are" statement. Hopefully, we can remember why we are put in the House of Commons and why we all chose to put our names on ballots and run. It's actually to deliver for our communities and Canadians. Now, Ms. Chagger has invoked time allocation to limit debate time on bills a half dozen times since the beginning of April. Well, that number will be higher today. She has been sharing less and less information in recent weeks with the opposition House leaders about the government's forthcoming agenda. That's according to the Conservative House leader, Candy Bergen. We're getting less and less notice, for example, of what the upcoming agenda will be, which I'm seeing is mismanagement. I don't think they're trying to be secretive. I think they just don't really have an idea of how they're going to wrap this session up neatly. Okay, well, that's the partisan statement going the other way. And it just goes on. Basically, the rest of the article is a little bit of a argument between Ms. Chagger and Ms. Bergen, so we can skip that. But as you can see, even at the end of May, everybody's ready to go. Oh yeah, it's trenches time. Oh, just imagine what all those MPs, how friendly they are by Thursday at about 10 p.m. I mean, I've worked 12s, but, I don't think they have. Okay, that brings us to June 18th, which is basically just a reality check. This is from yesterday, and this is a guide to what's left to pass. It's from Rachel Aiello at CTV. Back and forth on amendments between the House and Senate, one final Prime Minister's question period, and end of session celebratory remarks. Except all that and potentially more procedural wrangling in the final 3 days that the House of Commons is scheduled to be in session. After 4 years, more than 90 sitting weeks, and more than 100 pieces of government legislation tabled, the 42nd Parliament is nearing a close. MPs are set to decamp for their ridings at the end of this week, with senators following behind them a week later. Whatever legislation is left behind once Parliament adjourns for good will die on the order paper the minute that the fall federal election is called. Any not passed bill, whether a private member's bill or government legislation, would have to be reintroduced into the next Parliament by whomever forms government after the October 21st vote. Today, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is set to participate in one last House of Commons question period. Then, once Government House Leader Bardish Chagger rises to say, "Mr. Speaker, if you seek it, I believe you will find unanimous consent for the following motion," or something along those lines, and you'll know the session is coming to an end that day. Now, the motion could have an all-party agreement to pass multiple bills through various stages at once, agree to table outstanding committee reports and other housekeeping items to save time. Once this happens, each side will have a representative stand and deliver thank yous and goodbyes. Now, this happens at the end of most summer sessions, but this one has more finality. Now, speculation begins to swirl about a potential early rising of the session. Here's a recap of the active legislation still left to pass. Now, there's about a dozen others that aren't on this list that the government has already signaled they won't be advancing, including, for what's left to pass, a considerable and in recent memory, the largest number of Senate amended government bills. Now, there's a few things to keep in mind. First, the government has been routinely limiting the amount of debate time on the remaining government bills, especially those with Senate amendments. This, coupled with House sitting later most nights for the last few weeks, has resulted in bills moving through quicker than has been the case for most of this Parliament. Second, the prospect of one final opposition-prompted marathon voting session did not pan out. If there was to be another Conservative-led all-nighter of votes on various lines of the estimates, it had to happen June 18th, last night, and it didn't. So all the remaining House time can be capitalized on by the government. And should Parliament be recalled to ratify the new NAFTA in the summer, then the session doesn't necessarily have to be completely wrapped up by the end of June. If parliamentarians are recalled to vote on Bill C-100, they could deal with other bills that aren't dealt with before the end of June. Just because the House and Senate adjourn by month's end, it doesn't mean the Parliament has ended. So if a special summer session is in the cards, there will still be time to officially tie a bow on a few things. Now, bills in the House that still need full Senate study. Now, these bills have the furthest to go to make it. Bill C-98, which amends the RCMP Act and the Canadian Border Security Agency Act to set up a new oversight body for the two. Bill C-99, which amends the Citizenship Act to include in the citizenship oath that new Canadians have to promise to respect Indigenous treaty rights. I don't know why I have a problem with the word citizenship. Bill C-100 hasn't even been to the Senate yet. The new NAFTA implementation bill. It was tabled on May 29th and has since passed into committee study. Now, the government has indicated they're not going to try and rush this through. Regardless, if they get it done, even if they don't, the next government is certainly going to have to. Bill C-101, the steel industry bill that amends the Customs Tariff and the Canadian International Trade Tribunal Act to temporarily prevent a flooding of cheap steel being dumped into the Canadian market. Now, bills in the House that the Senate has sent back. Now, these are bills that the Senate has amended. And in all cases, the government has accepted some, but not all, of the Senate's proposed changes. Once the House votes on their responses to the amendments, then it goes back to the Senate, where senators can either agree to live with it or push back and demand more changes, which means it will likely die. Bill C-75, an omnibus piece of legislation. Remember, this government will never use omnibus legislation, that aims to reform a number of areas of Canada's criminal justice system and address court backlogs. It was tabled in March 2018, and the Senate Committee on Legal and Constitutional Affairs made a little more than half a dozen changes. So that has to be accepted or sent back. Bill C-83, which proposes to overhaul how federal inmates are separated from the general prison population, eliminating solitary confinement as it is known. This was tabled in October 2018 and was amended by the Senate Social Affairs, Science, and Technology Committee. Of course, C-83 is about response to the Supreme Court of Canada striking down solitary confinement. You're not going to find a lot of friends of this bill outside the government, but we'll get to it. We'll get to it. Bill C-91, the Indigenous Languages Act, which is aimed at reviving Indigenous languages and would create a new office of the Commissioner of Indigenous Languages. It's tabled in February of this year and has been brought through quickly, but not without a few changes. Bill C-92, which seeks to assert that Indigenous people have jurisdiction over child and family services in their communities. It was tabled in May and has been fast-tracked and was lightly amended by the Senate. So all those bills have a real good chance. They're all going to make it. Bills that have passed the House and are awaiting passage in the Senate. Now, these are bills that so far have not been amended by the Senate, meaning that if they remain that way, they can pass them through multiple readings with one vote. Now, among these is C-97, the Budget Implementation Bill, and that's a big deal. Bill C-88, which makes changes related to regional resource protections in the Mackenzie Valley in the Northwest Territories. It is currently before the Senate committee, and it's yet to be seen whether there will be amendments. Well, there's a spoiler for that about 2 hours ago. Bill C-93, the marijuana pardon legislation. That was tabled in May. It moved out of study at the Senate Legal Affairs Committee 2 days ago without amendment and is now at third reading. So that quite easily could make it. Here we are, Bill C-97, the Budget Implementation Act, 2019. Now, as is habit now in Canada, a budget bill makes all sorts of changes tied to the federal budget and also makes immigration law and housing rights changes. So that's at third reading in the Senate. Bill C-102 is an Appropriation Act, number 2 for 2019-2020. It's a routine spending bill, tabled, passed in the House in 1 week, and will move very quickly through the Senate. Now, what about bills that have bounced back to the Senate? Now, I mean, the government can either take the amendments from the Senate and that's it. It's passed. Or they can send back a note that says, well, we changed the wording in the amendments or we reject your amendments. But of them, how many are there? Well, our old friend Bill C-48, the Oil Tanker Moratorium Act. And as we talked about on the episode on The View Up Here about Bill C-48, it's starting to look like what I predicted. Everybody's pushing for a corridor amendment. Something's going to happen. It's not going to die. I mean, that's all there is to it. If the PMO has to give up some sort of corridor, they're just not going to call it a corridor. But it's going to happen, and that's where it's at. Bill C-58, the legislation that changes Canada's access to information law in several ways, including giving the new Information Commissioner new authority. Now, it's largely been panned as a bad bill that will not improve an already troubled freedom of information system. Well, I would have to agree with that, and so would a lot of other organizations, a few of whom you're familiar with if you listen to the show. ICLMG, for one, Access Now, lots of people. Shit bill, but hey, whatever. It's probably going to make it. Bill C-69, which makes a number of considerable changes, considering what the Senate sent back to the House. What was it, something like 300 amendments? No, I don't think so. What has made it through? What is going to get Royal Assent and become law? Well, it took them nearly 4 years, but Bill C-59, the National Security Act, the replacement for Harper's C-51, has been returned after the House accepted some, but not all Senate amendments, which the Senate agreed to accept yesterday. Bill C-68, the legislation that makes changes to the Fisheries Act, related to make clear the minister's authority and strengthen the powers for the enforcement of the law, tabled under Fisheries, Oceans, and Canadian Coast Guard portfolio. It passed yesterday. Bill C-77, which introduces a Victims' Bill of Rights for the military justice system. It passed on yesterday. Bill C-78, which updates family and divorce laws in an attempt to have more disputes settled out of court and amends the language related to custody, passed yesterday. Bill C-82, the Multilateral Instrument in Respect of Tax Conventions Act. That applies to everybody, right? What this bill does is change language here to harmonize with other jurisdictions for multinational corporations, who gets taxed, who doesn't, et cetera, Bill C-84, which amends the criminal code to crack down on bestiality and animal fighting offenses. That passed yesterday as well. So there is some good stuff that is getting done. One other thing I will add, for a difference between the 42nd Parliament and the 41st, I can remember at the end of the 41st Parliament, I figured, well, there's probably 4 or 5 federal acts that are unconstitutional. And as we come to the end of this Parliament, I'd say there's only 3 that pop to the top of my head. So I guess we're doing better somehow. Okay, the first one we're going to look at specifically is our friend Bill C-48. This has been such a big deal because of the topic matter, of course, and it's a black and white issue. Don't even think about that there hasn't been a freaking oil tanker in this stretch of coast for over 35 years. We can't have a formal ban. Well, if we go back 1 week ago, the ISG senators were proposing to amend to allow tanker access to the Nisga'a Nation. Now, see, already at this point, a week ago, they had moved away from this corridor word. And now it's about making sure that the Nisga'a Nation have their rights and title respected, making this federal law. It's a smoke job, but it's a good one. And this is from the Hill Times a week ago, Peter Mazaru. A group of independent senators is getting ready to propose 2 amendments to the government's controversial ban on oil tankers docking on the BC coast to allow pipeline and tanker access to the Nisga'a First Nation, says independent Alberta Senator Paula Simons. Now, the Nisga'a Nation is made up of 4 communities in northern BC, located on waterways with access to the Pacific Ocean. Now, the independent senators, including Senator Simons, Senator Yuen Paul Wu, Senator Patty Laboucaine-Benson, Senator Andre Pratt, Senator Bev Basson, Senator Murray Sinclair, and Senator Julie Mivelle-Deschênes have been working on amendments which would ban tankers. Yeah, we know that. The group has also reached out to Conservative Senator Dennis Patterson, who is handling the Conservative Senate caucus's amendments to the bill, looking for ways to cooperate. Senator Simon said the amendments that could be proposed as early as that day are different from corridor amendments to exempt tanker traffic from the ban if it follows a certain pathway. Transport Minister Marc Garneau has said the government will not accept a corridor through the protected area, arguing that any oil spilled in the corridor could spread through the water to other coastal areas, undermining the purpose of the bill. I've realized that calling it a corridor is the wrong strategy because the government has said they aren't going to accept a corridor, said Senator Simons. The trouble with calling it a corridor amendment is that I am not a marine cartographer. I lack the expertise to figure out where a corridor ought to go from an environmental perspective, from a navigation perspective. I don't know where the rocks are. What I'm looking for is not a corridor per se, but I'm looking at amendments that honor the treaty rights of the Nisga'a Nation. Well played, Senator. Well played. The Nisga'a have said to us, not that they want a pipeline and they want to ship oil, but they at least want to be consulted. They at least want to have the right to decide what development happens on their territory. The Nisga'a Nation is well suited as a place for oil exports to potentially flow from for several reasons, said Senator Simons, including that the Nisga'a Nation has a land treaty already in place, a large territory and community of several thousand inhabitants, ocean access, is located at the northern end of British Columbia, and because Community President Eva Clayton told senators during an April committee hearing that the Nisga'a Nation opposes Bill C-48 because it does not respect their right to determine the economic fortunes of their community. It is a valid point. Now, talking to Senator Pratt, who was on the Senate Transport Committee, told the Hill Times last week that the independent senators were looking at multiple options for creating a corridor amendment that would allow some oil tankers carrying crude or persistent oils access to the northern BC coast. We have to try and propose that compromise solution to the government and see what they do with it. Senator Simon says the independents have narrowed that to 2 amendments, both of which reference the Nisga'a treaty rights and are not contradictory, though she did not describe them as tanker corridors. I must say, it's hard to tell that Senator Simons wrote for the Edmonton Journal for 30-some years. Can't tell at all, can you? And then we go 2 days later from that, June 14th, iPolitics, Jolson Lim. Garneau says he's carefully assessing Senate changes to the oil tanker ban bill. The Liberal government's contentious bill that would ban oil tanker traffic from the northern BC coast is now back to the House with a Senate amendment. The Senate voted 45 to 29 to pass C-48 at third reading shortly after 11 p.m. on June 13th. The bill will now go back to the House, where elected members will decide whether to support the proposed changes. Members of the upper chamber endorsed a series of changes in a compromise amendment put forward by Independent Senator Murray Sinclair. It would require the federal environment minister to launch regional impact assessments of the ban and consult local Indigenous communities, oil-producing provinces, and the BC government. The assessment would also require the minister to consider adverse effects a ban would have on the rights of Indigenous peoples. A parliamentary committee would also have to review the ban 5 years after it comes into force. The amendment ultimately offers a small chance in the future for altering the ban and increases the level of Indigenous input. In a statement, Transport Minister Garneau said the government is now carefully assessing Sinclair's amendment. Now, of course, what do you expect a minister to say? C-48 is the fulfillment of an election promise we made to Canadians to protect BC's northern coast from the risk of a major oil spill. I'm pleased to see this important bill moving forward. We are carefully assessing the Senate's proposed amendment. Now, Conservative Senator Dennis Patterson, a critic on the bill, had put forward an amendment that would allow the Environment Minister to regulate the geographic coverage of a ban to ensure that the Nisga'a Nation has control over maritime access to its lands in accordance with its treaty. Patterson said yesterday that Sinclair's amendment did not include guarantees to the Nisga'a that their voices would be seriously considered. Isn't this just amazing? We have a Conservative senator who is the torch holder for an Indigenous nation. Wouldn't have anything to do with this being a Liberal campaign promise or anything. Independent Senator Paula Simons, who is seen as a swing voice, supported Sinclair's amendment, but said last night that she doesn't believe it goes quite far enough to ensure that the Nisga'a treaty rights are protected. She said Patterson's amendment helps us get the rest of the way there. Now, Conservative Senator David Kachuk, the Senate Transport Committee chair, had also put forward an amendment that would allow Cabinet to decide on a date for when the ban would come into force, but not until 2021. So that brings us to Monday, June 17th. Liberal government rejects regional assessments, but accepts a 5-year review. This is Jolson Lim and iPolitics. In a message to the Senate on Bill C-48, the House of Commons eliminated parts of an amendment passed by the Senate that will require the federal environment minister to launch regional assessments of the ban within 6 months of it coming into force. Other last-minute amendments proposed by Conservative senators that would open up a corridor to Nisga'a Nation lands and to delay the act coming into force, they were rejected by the full Senate. They didn't even go to the House. Now, the Senate will have to back off and endorse the latest text of the bill before it can move on to Royal Assent. Now, that was pretty much seemed like, well, they tried, they lost, now they'll just let it go. So they actually took no amendments, and they're still going to get it to pass. So, hey, they played, they won. Not bad. So C-48 for all the hemming and hawing will be law. I mean, like I said, there hasn't been a tanker on that coastline for over 35 years by a mutual agreement. So what's the big deal about making it codified. Oh, because now it means there's fines and shit? Is that it? Who knows? Whatever. But let's move on to a big boy, C-59. This is from My Politics, Marco Vigliotti. This is from yesterday. The Senate votes to push the Liberals' national security bill towards Royal Assent. The Trudeau government's national security legislation is set to become law after the Senate voted not to insist on amendments it made to the bill that were rejected by the Liberal majority in the House. Senators passed a motion by a 64 to 27 margin to not press the government to accept amendments they made to Bill C-59 that were rejected by the Liberals when the legislation was returned to the House. With that vote, the bill will now move to Royal Assent and become law. Now, introduced in June of 2017, Bill C-59 will establish a single national security review body with a government-wide mandate covering such agencies as CSIS, the RCMP, and create a list of activities CSIS can perform in its efforts to address national security threats. It will also create an act to govern the Communications Security Establishment, CSE, the country's national cryptologic agency, which Public Safety Minister Ralph Goodale has said would include a new regime for authorizing its activities for the first time ever. After the fact authorizing. Yeah, sure. Great. The changes also include a new dataset oversight regime for the CSE and a recourse mechanism for people inadvertently added to the no-fly list. The Liberals rejected Senate changes to the legislation that altered the mandate of the new office of the Intelligence Commissioner and wording of the terrorism counseling criminal offense detailed in the bill. The original wording of the offense in C-59 was modeled on other criminal code counseling offenses, which have been well used successfully and are very familiar to police, prosecutors, and judges alike. Now, Goodale noted that his staff consulted very carefully with the existing office of the CSE Commissioner, which will ultimately become the office of the new Intelligence Commissioner, about the Senate amendments. The office of the current Commissioner indicated a very strong preference for the existing language. The Liberals, though, accepted Senate amendments requiring parliamentary review of the bill every 3 years, as opposed to the original 5 years, and including a schedule where new agencies and departments could be added to ensure they are bound by the legislation. As initially passed by the House, the bill listed 5 specific agencies that it covered. But with the amendment to add a schedule, then it's merely an order in council or an order from the minister, and another organization now has to comply with C-59 for whatever good that does for you. But that is a definite step up, but there ain't many steps up in C-59. It took them a long time to get it through. Does it fix C-51? No. Does it fix a few things? Yeah. You know, what do you want me to say? Wow. Got a lot more, man. Boy, they've been busy. Too bad they didn't work like this all the time. My God. You'd think shit would be pretty smooth. C-68. This was to fix some of the things that the Conservative government did regarding waterways, protection of aquatic species, etc. This is from Monday. C-68 only got out of the House on Monday. This is from Marco Vigliotti, iPolitics. The House of Commons on June 17th voted to send government bills overhauling the Fisheries Act and scrapping Harper-era reforms to a northern regulator to the Senate for final approval. Now, MPs voted in favor of a message moved by the governing Liberals responding to changes made by the Senate to Bill C-68, which reworks the long-standing Fisheries Act. The Senate must now vote whether to accept the message, which would mean it would pass into law, or insist on their amendments. Now, in that message, the Liberals said they are rejecting Senate amendments that would change the definition of fish habitat and that would expand an offset credit program to outside groups. And they came back with changing language on 2 other Senate amendments. Now, Fisheries Minister Jonathan Wilkinson said last week the government would not accept an amendment from Senator Rosemary Poirier eliminating water frequented by fish from the definition of fish habitat in the Act because it goes against the objective of the bill. The inclusion of the term in the originally worded definition increases the scope for the application of the fish habitat protection provisions. He also said the Liberals are rejecting a Senate change permitting third-party habitat banking, a compensation tool designed to offset the impact on the environment and wildlife caused by human activity. Expanding fish habitat banking to third parties, as detailed in the Senate amendments, would allow any organization to earn credits through restoration and conservation efforts, which they could then sell to developers or other project proponents. Some senators also supported allowing project developers to pay an upfront fee instead of investing in offsetting projects. The Department of Fisheries and Oceans has been encouraging use of habitat banking since 2013, and C-68 would enshrine this policy approach into law while offering new incentives to use the banking credits to offset impacts on fish and fish habitat. So there we go, the fisheries bill, they're fighting over that. But yet, today, Marco Vigliotti again. The Trudeau government's rewrite of the Fisheries Act is set to become law after senators opted not to press on amendments they made to the bill that were rejected by the Liberal majority House. Senators on yesterday, voted not to insist on amendments. With that vote, Bill C-68 now moves toward Royal Assent, ensuring it will become law before the House and Senate rise for the summer break. Parliament is not expected to resume sitting before the writs are issued for the federal election. Several environmental and conservation advocacy groups applauded the bill's passage, specifically provisions protecting fish habitat, new sustainability efforts, and banning the import and export of shark fins in Canada. The Liberal government has framed Bill C-68 as an effort to restore crucial protections axed from the Fisheries Act by the previous Conservative government in 2012, while adding new safeguards to protect fish and their habitat. Now, prior to 2012, the Fisheries Act protected all fish habitat in Canada, but the Harper government removed the prohibition against the harmful alteration, disruption, or destruction of fish habitat in a bid to reduce red tape and make life easier for farmers. Bill C-68 will restore this protection, as well as amend the Fisheries Act to direct the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans to manage fish stocks sustainably and put rebuilding plans in place for depleted stocks. Well, Bill C-68 was passed by the House last June. It spent a year in the Senate. Wow. Now, Senator Peter Harder, the government's representative in the Senate, moved 28 amendments to Bill C-68 last month during clause-by-clause consideration by the Senate Fisheries and Oceans Committee. One of the amendments included banning the practice of shark finning and the import and export of shark fins, including or excluding human-made agricultural waterways from being designated as a fish habitat. Yeah, that makes sense. And making it mandatory to have a permit for the import and export of the class of marine mammals that includes whales and dolphins. When C-68 returned to the House earlier in June, Fisheries Minister Jonathan Wilkinson moved a motion saying the Liberal government would accept most of the amendments, except for 4 changes. Of those 4, the government proposed relatively minor language tweaks to 2 of them and flatly rejected the others. So there you go. That is a campaign promise. Restore protection, general protection to the waterways is done. I didn't think they'd get it done because it just faded away forever. Talk about a big bill. C-69. The overhaul of the environmental assessments in Canada. To say it's needed is an absolute understatement. After the ECAA 2012, nothing has worked. Everything has been a waste of time and a waste of money. You look back, we had the entire board for the hearings for Energy East all had to be removed because they were all playing both sides of the coin. We got the shit with TMX and everything else. Yeah, you think we need to change these laws? Just remember that when you see the politicians that say there's nothing wrong with the way things are now. And having actual rules is the no pipelines ever again law. Well, they couldn't get them built with the shit law. So what's the difference, man? Going to go back to June 7th. This is from the Narwhal, Sarah Cox. The Senate changes to the Environmental Assessment Bill are worse than the Harper-era legislation. Now, Alberta Premier Jason Kenney calls Bill C-69 the No More Pipelines Act and says he'll take the proposed environmental impact legislation to court if it becomes law. True to Kenney's wishes, the bill, which introduces new rules for reviewing major projects like mines and pipelines, following the gutting of environmental assessment legislation by the former Harper government, received far more than a nip and a tuck in the Senate. Major reconstructive surgery came in the form of 187 amendments approved by the Senate, following intense lobbying led by the oil and gas industry and an in-person appeal by Alberta Premier Jason Kenney. The new Premier traveled to Ottawa only days after he was sworn in, telling members of the Senate's Energy Committee that Bill C-69 was the culmination of a full frontal attack on Alberta's economic prosperity. But the Senate's surgery to the bill is so extreme, with many of its wide-ranging amendments mirroring requests from the oil and gas industry, some of them verbatim, that environmental law experts say Canada would be better off leaving the Harper-era environmental assessment legislation in place. University of Calgary Law Associate Professor Martin Olzinski. Unless the vast majority of those amendments are rejected, then it's worse than what we have right now. What's happened now is just ridiculous. The Senate changes are not thought out. They're essentially putting so many holes in the ship that it won't even hold water. Bob Gibson, a University of Waterloo professor in the Department of Environmental and Resource Studies, examined the fine print of every one of the Senate's 187 amendments and wrote a detailed 20-page analysis. He recommended that virtually all the amendments be rejected. Gibson said in an interview, "A lot of the amendments are badly drafted. The amendments, to me, look like a large portion of it is driven by political optics more than substantive consideration. I think a lot of it is fairly cynical, and I think a lot of it is ill-informed. Now, following a report from an expert panel that traveled across the country, hearing from stakeholders in 21 cities, Federal Environment Minister Catherine McKenna introduced Bill C-69 in February of 2018, saying the legislation would ensure more timely and predictable project reviews that would attract investment and development. Now, the 340-page bill replaces the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency with the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada. It also makes changes to the Navigable Waters Act and overhauls the beleaguered National Energy Board, replacing it with the Canada Energy Regulator. The new Impact Assessment Agency would review all major projects in the country, assessing not just the environmental impacts, but also the social, economic, and health impacts, as well as effects on Indigenous peoples. Establishes timelines for assessments and requires that impacts on Indigenous rights and culture be considered early on. Now, both Mr. Olszynski and Mr. Gibson say that Bill C-69 is neither anti-pipeline nor is it pro-pipeline. Gibson said, since the current federal government bought a pipeline out of devotion to getting resources to market and or retaining associated votes, it's a safe bet that they don't intend for C-69 to be anti-pipeline. Indications are that more pipeline and oil and gas projects would be exempted from environmental review under Bill C-69 than under the existing law. Wow, isn't that interesting? But according to, everybody who says we need pipelines says it's just the deaths. I don't get it. Olszynski described the majority of the Senate committee amendments as akin to putting Bill C-69 through some kind of incoherence-generating machine. They've just essentially attacked various aspects, various provisions. Much of it is at the request of the oil and gas industry, and some of it from the independent senators group, who I think failed to appreciate just how complex and interconnected all these different parts are. As one example, Olszynski pointed to a Senate amendment that would require the new assessment agency to respect something called a principle of proportionality, involving the time and money proponents spent on studies during an assessment. Olszynski said he is not aware of the existence of a principle of proportionality in environmental assessment regimes anywhere in the world. He said it's hard to imagine a more uncertain provision, given that critics of Bill C-69 say they want more certainty in environmental legislation. Before any amendments, Bill C-69 would require decision makers to consider the extent to which a project would hinder or contribute to meeting Canada's climate change commitments. But the projects don't have to help Canada meet those commitments. We just, we're going to figure it out. Nor would major projects be rejected if they make it more difficult for Canada to meet commitments. When you look at even the most massive greenhouse gas emissions emitting plants, they are all insignificant on a global level, Olszynski said. He pointed to Shell Canada's Jack Pine oil sands mine north of Fort McMurray as an example of the argument that carbon emissions from a major Canadian project should be discounted in light of global emissions. Shell argued that greenhouse gas emissions associated with the expansion, roughly the equivalent of putting 281,000 new cars on the road a year, were negligible because they only represented 0.5% of Alberta's total emissions. So 281,000 times 200. That's Alberta's emissions for a year. Gibson said the great elephant in the room with the Senate amendments is climate change, pointing out that the science says we have to be down to net zero by 2050 to avoid catastrophic climate change. Understandably, the oil sector, including the pipeline interests, would much rather not have climate mentioned in the assessment law, or to have it delayed and muted by a long extended and heavily lobbied policy exercise. But they won't delay actual climate change or associated damage and outrage, nor will it make new bitumen extraction operations and new dilbit pipelines a better bet for investors who can see ahead to stranded assets, or to Albertans who wonder how the Albertan economy will support their children. Shortly after the Senate voted to accept their amendments, Kenney tweeted his approval, saying he was very pleased. In a subsequent statement, Kenney noted that the amendments adopted by the Senate were proposed by the Alberta government, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, and the Canadian Energy Pipelines Association. Well, at least they're just coming out and telling you flat out. Okay, June 12th, moving along. This is what the House had to say about all those wonderful amendments. This is from the National Observer, Carl Meyer. Trudeau Liberals refuse to copy and paste oil lobby plan into law. Now, the Trudeau government is accepting dozens of changes made by the Senate to its bill overhauling the environmental assessment regime for fossil fuel and other projects, but is rejecting dozens of others, mainly backed by conservative senators. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is trying to shepherd one of his government's signature pieces of environmental legislation through Parliament with just a few days left before the government breaks for the summer. In doing so, he's facing down premiers in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, New Brunswick, and the Northwest Territories, not to mention the conservative opposition in Parliament, who are all unhappy with how the government has dealt with the Senate's amendments to the bill. The government signaled last Wednesday it had accepted 62 of those amendments verbatim, and a further 37 with alterations. However, roughly 90% of the 89 remaining amendments that were rejected had been proposed by conservative senators. A statement from Environment and Climate Change Minister Catherine McKenna: "We promised to put in better rules for major projects that restored the trust of the public, protect the environment, advance reconciliation, ensure good projects can go ahead in a timely way. However, we will not be accepting amendments that weaken the rules." The minister said that conservative politicians want to replace environmental review with what she called a pipeline approval process. They want us to copy and paste recommendations written by oil lobbyists, for example, that would block court challenges, that would make it easier for future governments to ignore the views of Indigenous peoples, that would limit Canadians' input and shut Canadians out of the process, and that would increase political interference in decision-making. And of course, later on, 3 energy ministers, Ontario, Alberta, and Saskatchewan, expressed disappointment in the rejections. And they came up with these ridiculous numbers. Alberta Energy Minister Sonia Savage, Ontario Energy Minister Greg Rickford, and Saskatchewan Energy Minister Bronwyn Eyre said that the legislation would cost jobs without providing evidence to back up their claims. Savage claimed, without evidence, that the Trudeau government was willing to sacrifice every single one of the 533,000 jobs created by the oil and gas industry across Canada in an attempt to fill a misguided political promise. Greg Rickford, who was part of the former Harper government in Ottawa, who was part of the government that put us in this predicament, described Trudeau's efforts as misguided. This radical piece of legislation sacrifices economic growth of Ontario, by trampling our provincial jurisdiction over nuclear power. I'm familiar with C-69. There's really nothing changed. Are you going to be building new reactors? Why do you even give a shit about assessment? What are you talking about? Whew. The Canadian press reported some of the changes made by the Senate were word-for-word proposals by energy groups. House Leader Bartis Chagger said the government would quickly start the debate on its response to the Senate's proposed amendments. Environmental lawyers said they were pleased with how the government had dealt with the amendments, saying they preserved key safeguards that the Trudeau government promised voters in the 2015 election. But I am going to go to an article from Monday. Peter Mazaru, Hill Times. Environmental Assessment Bill enters final stretch in Senate. So this was on Monday. So they did get nearly 100 amendments, which includes the 100 that came from the House. Debate on the government's message on the amendments rejected and accepted, expected to begin Monday night. Now, the Senate had returned 188 amendments on June 6th. The government replied with its message to the Senate June 13th, accepting 62, modifying 37, and rejecting the rest. Now, how did the Senate view this from an administrative or institutional point of view? I think already we can say that the message is a victory, if you will, for the Senate, said the Independent Senators Group leader, Yuen Pa Wu. I think this is a remarkable demonstration of what the contemporary Senate can do. It can really provide substantive, sober second thought, said Independent Senator Paula Simons. These amendments are not window dressing. These are amendments that, for example, reduce dramatically the role and power and responsibility of the minister to micromanage the assessment process and returns that assessment process back to the hands of the objective regulator. Now, regarding the debate that the Senate will have at this point, Senator Wu comments, I don't think there will be a lot of speeches. The important thing is for senators to do their homework in looking at the message and understanding it, but I think we should be able to come to a vote before the end of next week. I don't think there is much appetite among all the groups in the Senate to go beyond the scheduled date to rise for the summer, June 28th. Then I talk about who criticized it, blah, blah, blah. Moving on, another one that was a big deal to some, invisible to most, Bill C-71, the Liberals' reform on firearms in Canada. This is from May 28th. Remember, there was a lot of stink in the House at first, but nothing was changing. The majority was happening. Closure. Let's go, let's go, let's go. This is from My Politics, Tim Nometz. Liberal gun legislation nears the finish line. Now, this liberal gun legislation that has been hotly contested since it was tabled by government 14 months ago will at last reach its final vote in Parliament after a last opposition blast at the bill during Senate debate. This chamber will send it back to the other place unamended. And that quote came from Conservative Senator Don Plett. Plett predicted that would be the result, as he outlined for the last time the determined opposition to the legislation among many gun owners and their lobby groups. This bill does nothing to address gun violence, Plett said in the final hour of debate, after a last Conservative attempt to amend the bill was voted down by the majority of independent and Liberal senators in the chamber. With the Conservatives reduced to a minority in the Senate, the vote yesterday means Royal Assent is the only step remaining. The bill contains a series of new safeguards over firearm licensing, including a possible lifetime background check on license applications and renewals, and reinstatement of mandatory record keeping by gun dealers and retailers. The legislation almost entirely covers only the sale or transfer of non-restricted rifles and shotguns, but also includes elements to reinstate control over the transport of restricted and prohibited firearms that had been withdrawn under the previous Conservative government. The bill would also reverse a decision by the previous government to amend the criminal code in a way that gives Cabinet the authority to override RCMP classification of restricted and prohibited firearms and apply a lower level of restriction. Bill C-71 specifically singles out certain models of imported military rifles from the Czech Republic and others from Switzerland, for which the Conservative cabinet, under pressure from gun owners, had eased restrictions shortly before Harper called the election campaign in 2015. The legislation also reinstates a regime for confirmation of license validity through the RCMP firearms registrar, while avoiding the reinstatement of a national registry of non-restricted rifles and shotguns. So they're crying about that coming back. No, it's not back. The gun registry is not back. So that's also an election promise. Done. Who remembers the Jordan decision of the Supreme Court? You should. Most of the people in Quebec charged in SNC-Lavalin corruption and fraud all walked because of that decision. Bill C-75 was meant to make changes to try and prevent that in the justice system. Also some other fooling around with criminal justice. This is from yesterday in iPolitics. Marco Vigliori and Jolson Lim. Liberal government rejects the Senate amendment to the Criminal Justice Bill C-75. The Trudeau government is rejecting a Senate change to its criminal justice legislation on the use of non-lawyer agents by defendants, while accepting other amendments on collecting DNA samples and fingerprints. On Monday, the Liberals moved a message in the House responding to changes made by the Senate to Bill C-75. In the message, the Liberals say they are not accepting a Senate amendment that would allow non-lawyer agents to represent defendants standing trial for summary convictions if authorized by the province where the proceeding is taking place. Agents are permitted in most provinces to represent clients for relatively minor provincial offenses, but not for more serious charges. Liberal MP Colin Fraser, rising in the House to defend the message, said the amendment was rejected because the government does not have any information about how the proposed change would operate with existing provincial and territorial laws. So he's basically saying it's too late for that. But Fraser said the Liberals are supporting a Senate amendment that would continue to permit the discretionary collection of DNA samples from offenders convicted of indictable offenses the government wants to hybridize in C-75 that currently come with maximum penalties of 5 to 10 years in prison. The Liberals are also backing Senate change to the Identification of Criminals Act, clarifying that fingerprints can be taken by the authorities from people accused of a hybrid charge, even if prosecutors try the case through a summary conviction offense. Well, that's kind of a burn. According to Justice Canada, a person charged with a summary conviction offense is typically not even arrested unless found literally committing the crime. The message responding to the changes will almost certainly pass the House, but must then be approved for the legislation to move to Royal Assent. Now, Bill C-75 represents the government's efforts to ease the country's problematic court delays. Now, a study put together by Global News determined that delays were a factor in over 800 criminal cases that were thrown out since the Supreme Court's landmark Jordan decision in 2016. In a bid to erase the backlog of cases delaying court trials, Bill C-75 would make 118 currently straight indictable offenses that come with maximums of 2, 5, or 10 years into hybrid ones. The Liberals are also proposing in the bill to increase the maximum penalties for summary convictions to just under 2 years. For hybrid offenses, the Crown can choose whether to proceed by indictment or summary conviction. Summary offenses are less serious, as the maximum penalty is currently 6 months and or a $5,000 fine. Indictment offenses capture far more serious conduct, like murder and aggravated assault. Now, the Liberals hope these changes will ease the strain on superior courts, which handle more serious offenses compared to the provincial and territorial courts. Since they handle cases that come with greater penalties, superior courts have heftier procedural requirements, including jury trials and preliminary inquiries. There you go. That's been a long time getting to this point as well. That was a bill that was introduced by the former Minister of Justice. But they're flying off the press, I'll tell you that. Here's one from just this afternoon, C-77 and C-78. Just flying through the Senate. This is from iPolitics staff. The Senate has given final approval to government bills overhauling child custody rules in divorce proceedings and adding new rights for victims in the military justice system. Senators on Tuesday voted to adopt at third reading Bill C-77 and Bill C-78 without amendments. So no problem at all. Earlier in the day, senators defeated an amendment to C-77 from Conservative Senator Pierre-Hugh Boisvenu that would require the defense minister to implement a training strategy for military justice participants working with victims 1 year after the legislation comes into force. He wanted more reports, he wanted this, he wanted that. It didn't happen, got defeated. Bill C-77 will create a Bill of Rights for victims in the military justice system, affording them access to certain information and protection available to victims in the civilian criminal justice structure. It will also create a new type of military violation termed a service infraction. This is for most minor breaches of conduct that would follow different legal procedures than those for more serious offenses. Now, Bill C-78, which has been in the Senate since February, looks to encourage more families to settle disputes outside of the courtroom, provide greater focus on the well-being of impacted children in custody disputes, and better enforce child support requirements, including permitting authorities to use tax information to enforce support payments. It also replaces terms in divorce proceedings such as custody and access with parenting orders and parenting time, as well as requiring the courts to consider family violence and other factors when deciding parenting arrangements. The bill makes changes to the Divorce Act, the Family Orders and Agreements Enforcement Assistance Act, and the Garnishment, Attachment, and Pension Diversion Act. If you're that much of a deadbeat on your maintenance, they can go after your pension. Interesting. Okay, the one I mentioned earlier off the top, C-82, the Tax Treaties Bill. This is from yesterday as well. Senate passed its third reading without amendments. And like I said, this is just so our tax laws, nobody can catch us on a technicality because it's different somewhere else and we didn't know, blah, blah, blah. C-83, the Solitary Confinement Bill, a bill that you'll find supporters and opponents, without a doubt. I had the view of the Harper government that every time the Supreme Court would overturn a law, tell them they have a year to make a replacement, the replacement would look amazingly like the law that was just deemed unconstitutional. There have been a lot of people that are saying that C-83 looks amazingly like the law that was struck down by the Supreme Court. against solitary confinement. June 14th, so the end of last week. National Observer, Teresa Wright. Solitary confinement bill passes in Senate with changes supported by 100 lawyers. A bill that aims to end solitary confinement has passed in the Senate with a number of amendments. Changes a large group of lawyers and law societies say are necessary to ensure the bill stays on the right side of the law. Senators passed Bill C-83 at third reading, complete with a package of amendments, including adding judicial oversight to decisions about isolating prisoners, more supports for inmates with mental illnesses, and community-based options for rehabilitating Indigenous people and members of other vulnerable populations. Now it'll be up to the Liberal government to decide whether to accept the proposed changes. It has already been decided in two separate decisions in British Columbia and Ontario courts that segregation without a cap and without independent oversight violates the Charter. With respect, we submit that passing a bill while knowing full well that it is unconstitutional is not only a waste of taxpayers' money, but it also raises questions regarding Canada's commitment to the rule of law. That statement came from more than 100 legal experts who signed a letter en masse. Now, last October, Public Safety Minister Ralph Goodale announced that Bill C-83 would end the practice of segregating federal prisoners who pose risks to security or themselves. Inmates who do pose risks would instead be moved to new structured intervention units, where they are supposed to get better programming in mental health care and more contact with people. Now, in their letter, the lawyers say they believe these new units are solitary confinement under a different name, a concern that has been echoed by a number of human rights organizations. The lawyers and legal scholars who signed the letter are urging the government to pass the bill with the amendments made by the Senate committee that studied the issue. We believe that these amendments transform what was a meaningless bill into a document that has the potential to make some positive changes in the lives of prisoners and uphold Canada's international human rights obligations. Senator Kim Pate, who sponsored many of the changes and who has been a lifelong advocate for prisoners' rights, said she remains optimistic the Liberal government will accept the revisions. But if the changes that would have judges examine isolation decisions are not accepted, she said it will remain unconstitutional. Minister Goodale's spokesperson, Scott Bardsley, said the minister will announce the government's response to the Senate's amendments in the next couple days. But he also said the minister vigorously disagrees that Bill C-83 just preserves solitary confinement under a different name and stressed the new intervention units will be qualitatively different. Inmates will be legally entitled to meaningful human contact every day, and programs and rehabilitation will be provided. As for judicial oversight, Bardsley said having isolation decisions reviewed by judges on a routine basis would be a considerable and unnecessary burden on the court system. C-83 not only creates a new way of managing inmates who need to be separated for safety reasons, it also creates meaningful external review of those placements. So, that brings us to Monday. iPolitics, Marco Viglioli. Liberals move time allocation for the corrections bill. The federal Liberals have successfully moved a motion limiting the time available for debate and the response to Senate amendments. The House on June 17th voted in favor of a time allocation motion for a message to the upper chamber on changes it made to Bill C-83. The one thing in here that says that I wasn't in the other articles, calls for reforms to the existing system grew after 19-year-old Ashley Smith died by suicide in 2007 after spending over 1,000 days in solitary confinement. Indeed, that was the start of the change. The Liberals say they are accepting Senate amendments to C-83 requiring a mental health assessment of all inmates within 30 days of admission into federal custody and within 24 hours of being moved to an SIU. They also accept rearranging a section of the bill to emphasize the possibility of transferring inmates to outside hospitals, in addition to rewriting several changes proposed by the upper chamber. However, the government is rejecting a Senate amendment extending healing lodges for Indigenous corrections to other unspecified groups, calling it a major policy change that should only be contemplated following considerable study and consultation. The Liberals warn that move would also impede the ability of the Correctional Service of Canada to be part of decisions to transfer inmates to healing lodges. Liberals are also axing Senate amendments extending another concept specifically designed for Indigenous corrections, community release, to other groups and permitting offender sentences to be shortened as a result of the conduct of correctional staff. Both proposals require more study and consultation, according to the Liberals. Now, the message is all but certain to pass through the House and must then be accepted by the Senate. So, well, I mean, we talked about, in the last 20 minutes, we talked about 4 or 5 bills that went back to the Senate, and the government said, no, shove your amendments. Oh, okay. C-84. iPolitics staff, this is from today. Bill broadening the definition of bestiality is set to become law. The Senate has passed Liberal government legislation broadening the definition of bestiality to include all sexual acts involving animals. Bill C-84, which also strengthens laws against animal fighting, was passed by the Senate at third reading without amendments. On Tuesday night. And this was passed on third reading in the House of Commons by a vote of 276-0. This bill was prompted by a 2016 Supreme Court ruling that had the effect of more narrowly restricting the definition of bestiality in the criminal code as penetration involving a person and an animal. Now, this is a case where the courts say this is what your law is, it's kind of shitty. And this is actually being done in the right way, as opposed to some of the stuff like the solitary confinement. Animal protection advocates applauded passage of Bill C-84, with the National Organization for Humane Societies and SPCAs applauding Parliament for taking meaningful steps to improve animal welfare. There are provisions in C-84 requiring anyone convicted of bestiality to be placed on Canada's National Sex Offenders Registry and removing the requirement for a perpetrator to attend a fight in person to be convicted under the animal fighting law. So there you go, more good news. Okay, now we're going to move to the Indigenous rights part of the evening. As I have been learning more and more as a settler about what's going on right now, about how much manufactured division there is in Canada in the Indigenous sphere. I had no idea it is becoming as spread as it is. There are now Indigenous groups that seem to not, in my opinion, not sound Indigenous at all anymore. We'll have to see what happens. I mean, the original peoples and settlers were all human, so, there are people who are susceptible to certain things in every group. We'll have to see how it goes, but what we're going to talk about here are the bills C-91, C-92, and the private members bill from Romeo Saganash, C-262. First thing I'm going to read is from June 12th in the Hill Times. This is basically an opinion piece from National Chief of the AFN, Perry Bellegarde. This article is a week old as I read it. The 42nd Parliament of Canada is coming to a close, and in the Senate chamber, democracy itself is being denied. There are 3 bills before the Senate right now that are of tremendous importance to First Nations and Canada, and everyone who cares about justice, human rights, and democracy. All 3 bills are at risk of falling prey to partisan political games. Bill C-91 is about protecting and revitalizing Indigenous languages, the same languages deliberately taken away from us through policies like the residential school system. Our languages are the foundation of our cultures and identities, central to our health and wellness. Studies show that when young people know their language, they are more successful in school and in life. The success of First Nations, the youngest, fastest growing population in Canada, is Canada's success. If we support our languages, we will see graduation rates go up and employment increase, which is good for everyone. A 2017 Nanos survey showed 74% of Canadians support this work. This bill deserves support of all parties. Bill C-92 is about recognizing First Nations jurisdiction over the welfare of First Nations children. The current system rewards apprehension, and we see the results in the mass overrepresentation of our children in the child welfare system. Children who are ripped from their parents and families. Bill C-92 places a premium on prevention over apprehension, on ending the harm our children suffer from the very system that is supposed to protect them. The way to end this harm is to put authority where it has always belonged, with First Nations governments, and the responsibility for care where it has always belonged, with parents, relatives, and community. The result will be better outcomes for our children and better outcomes for Canada. Bill C-262 is meant to give life to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in Canada. It is essential to fulfilling Canada's commitment to implement the UN Declaration. The Declaration is our roadmap to reconciliation. Its implementation is crucial to the full recognition of First Nations fundamental human rights. Bill C-262 will put in place, in the words of the Declaration, the minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of the Indigenous peoples. It will clarify rights, roles, and responsibilities. It will make it more likely to achieve mutually beneficial agreements and certainty. We know there is fear-mongering about the Declaration's recognition of our rights, but the fact is those rights already exist and are affirmed in many Supreme Court decisions. Economic uncertainty, conflict, and court cases come about when governments try to dismiss or diminish those rights. The UN Declaration is a path forward to peace and prosperity for First Nations and Canada. These are critical priorities. This is an opportunity to make history and celebrate success on issues that we have grappled with for decades. Now is the time for action. But it all hangs by a thread. Senators representing Her Majesty's loyal opposition control the legislative process in the Senate, a result of the increased number of independent senators and the removal of procedural control from the Government of Canada in the Senate. If a majority of senators have their way, they will kill Bill C-262. Partisan procedural games and tactics are preventing Bill C-262 from even coming before the Senate for a vote at third reading. This, in turn, prevents the progress of other bills through the system. This is a gross undermining of the democratic process. If we lose this opportunity for significant process, the result will be as predictable as it is devastating. More court cases, more economic uncertainty, rights denied, a continuation of colonialism, and an ongoing gap in the quality of life that swallows too many of our people into poverty, ill health, injustice, and despair. All three pieces of legislation sit in the Senate today, subject to the whim of a small group of senators. Canadians need to understand that their rights, the economy, and their democracy are at risk. Let's all stand up and demand a Canada that works for us all. Okay. Of course, National Chief Bellegarde is not exactly everybody's friend in the Indigenous world. He did bend the truth a couple times there, but what he said makes a lot of sense. Now, I just want to cover exactly what Bill C-91 does. The short title is the Indigenous Languages Act. This was only tabled in the House in February of this year, and boom, here we are, ready to be made law. Now, it provides, among other things, that the Government of Canada recognizes that the rights of Indigenous peoples recognized and affirmed by Section 35 of the Constitution include rights related to Indigenous languages. The Minister of Canadian Heritage may enter into different types of agreements or arrangements in respect of Indigenous languages with Indigenous governments or other Indigenous governing bodies, taking into account the unique circumstances and needs of Indigenous groups, communities, and peoples. There's provision for translation of anything involving the federal government into Indigenous languages, and it also establishes the Office of the Commissioner of Indigenous Languages and sets out its mandate. Now, what's included in that is to support the efforts of Indigenous peoples to reclaim, revitalize, maintain, and strengthen Indigenous languages, promote public awareness of, among other things, the richness and diversity of Indigenous languages, undertake research or studies in respect of the provision of funding for the purposes of supporting Indigenous languages and in respect of the use of Indigenous languages in Canada, provide services including mediation or other culturally appropriate services to facilitate the resolution of disputes, annual reports, etc., etc. That's what this bill is written to do. February 5th, again, when it came out, Marco Vigliotti, iPolitics, the Liberal government has introduced legislation aimed at protecting threatened Indigenous languages in Canada that promises more substantial support from Ottawa, including establishing a new Indigenous Languages Commissioner. However, the national group representing Inuit people say the bill does not protect the right to speak their own language or include measures necessary to support its revitalization, maintenance, and promotion. The new bill promises to support and promote the use of Indigenous languages in Canada, establish measures to ensure long-term funding, and reflect the objectives of the UN's UNDRIP, as well as the Commissioner's Office. While we cannot change the past, we can and we must together work for a better future, and we will do this with this bill. Minister Pablo Rodriguez, Minister of Canadian Heritage, said at an event Tuesday, marking the introduction of the bill at the National Arts Centre. Now, he was joined with AFN Perry Bellegarde, Métis Nation Minister of Heritage and Culture Clara Morin-Dalcal, but a representative from the Inuit Tapiriit Kanatame, the ITK, which represents Inuit people, were conspicuously absent. Now, the government claimed to have collaborated with all three national organizations in developing the bill and said they would continue working with them in the coming months through the next stages. However, the ITK released a statement shortly after this event accusing the Liberal government of engaging in bad faith with Inuit people on developing the bill. President Nathan Obed said the absence of Inuit-specific content suggests the bill is yet another legislative initiative developed behind closed doors by a colonial system and then imposed on Inuit. The ITK says Inuktitut is the most resilient Indigenous language spoken in Canada, with 84% of Inuit within the 51 communities in their traditional territory, which is known as Inuit Nunangat, reporting the ability to speak the language. Inuktitut is the official language in Nunavut and the Northwest Territories, and is an official language of the Nunatsiavut government in northern Labrador. The ITK said it initially saw the bill as a way to build on existing language rights and end the long-standing legislative gap that enables continued discrimination against Inuktitut speakers. Federal funding policies provide far fewer resources for Inuktitut speakers than those that speak French and English, and Inuit people do not have the right to access federal services in Inuktitut, relegating its status to below French and English. The ITK claimed to have provided a number of documents to the government proposing solutions, namely adoption of an Inuktitut-specific standalone bill drafted by the group, as well as 11 Inuktitut-specific provisions for inclusion in the broader legislation. It cautioned that the new Indigenous Languages Commissioner's Office would be a powerless advocacy body, besieged by costly reporting duties and controlled by Ottawa, and noted that the bill mandates no federal obligation to fund Indigenous languages, similar to the Official Languages Act. Well, what's the government got to say? Well, nothing's perfect. The AFN and the Métis Nation both voiced strong approval of the new bill. Yeah, they're in. The Innu are out and are not impressed. Now, okay, I'm going to turn to Bill C-262. This has been the subject of a lot of shenanigans, slowdowns. I don't know exactly what the Conservatives' problem is with this. Maybe it's because of the principle of adapting to UNDRIP. Maybe because it comes from a NDP private members bill. Maybe it's something else. That's up to you to decide. But iPolitics, Jolson Lim, this is from today. This is interesting because this came up in the Senate, and it was mentioned by the government's representative in the Senate. And it was during debate about C-262. Trudeau to run on implementing UNDRIP, as a private bill is in peril in the Senate. The Trudeau Liberals will run on implementing UNDRIP in the fall election, the government's representative in the Senate says. Senator Peter Harder told the Senate chamber this afternoon that if re-elected, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau would implement the UN Declaration affirming Indigenous rights that would require the harmonization of laws with the text of the instrument. On behalf of the government and Prime Minister, I've been authorized to formally announce in this chamber that in the forthcoming election, the Liberal Party of Canada will campaign on a promise to implement as government legislation the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Conservative senators have been holding up Bill C-262, a private member's bill introduced by New Democrat Member of Parliament Romeo Saganash in 2016, by using procedural tricks to run out the clock on required study, debate, and voting. Senator Harder said he doesn't believe there's enough time to get Bill C-262 passed because of the lack of agreement among senators on bringing the legislation forward. At second reading in the Senate, Harder voted in favor of the bill, which the Liberal government has said it supports. The Liberal government removed Canada's objector status to the United Nations Declaration in May 2016 and announced its support of Saganash's private members bill in November 2017. Around then, there had been hopes it would table its own bill that would allow it more priority in clearing through the House of Commons and the Senate. Assembly of First Nations National Chief Perry Bellegarde told the Hill Times in December 2017 that he believed the government would table its own bill implementing UNDRIP in order for it to be passed before the end of Parliament. Private members' business in both chambers and committee is typically reserved for limited time slots and requires agreement from different affiliated parliamentarians to effectively clear through legislative steps and become law. Unless passed by the Senate by the end of this week, Bill C-262 is effectively dead on the order paper. That is interesting. And I don't think it's over. I really think the Liberal government, the PMO, instructing Senator Hodder to make that announcement, I think that is a definite campaign. Trying not to be a smartass here. This is a definite carrot put out to Indigenous people to vote Liberal again. We'll make sure UNDRIP is part of the law. We will, really. So, I mean, that is a huge difference between the Liberals and the Conservatives. As far as the NDP go, you don't even have to mention it. Yes, of course they would do it. It's not a question to them. Okay, get this one in. C-93. This is from yesterday. Charlie Pinkerton, iPolitics. Pot pardons bill clears Senate committee without amendments. Senate committee responsible for studying the government's pot pardons bill has given the legislation its approval without amendments, sending it back to the Senate for its final legislative steps. In a short June 17th night meeting, members of the Senate Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee agreed to Bill C-93 as is, only noting to include several observations in their report back to the upper chamber. Bill C-93, which was first tabled in the House in March, would allow individuals who were convicted of possessing less than 30 grams of cannabis before the Trudeau government legalized pot to apply for cost-free, expedited record suspensions. Senate Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee members agreed to include in their report a call on the government to reform the Criminal Records Act, which created the pardons program, as well as for broader reform of the criminal record system to ensure that no one is prevented from seeking a record suspension because they lack legal or financial resources. Senators suggested the government improve how it tracks criminal records across Canada, and that the necessary technology be implemented to allow for future record suspensions to be completed without fee or application. Well, that's a good trick, because the Harper government was the one that started jacking up all the costs for a pardon as a discouragement. So, talk about a 180. As well, the committee pointed out that barriers like the application fee for a pardon, which typically costs $631, but was waived for applicants under Bill C-93, and the complexity of the process have a negative effect on someone's ability to successfully integrate back into a community. Senators on the committee suggested that provinces that don't have laws preventing discrimination on the basis of pardoned criminal records consider adopting legislation that does as much. The committee also recommended the government create an awareness campaign in collaboration with community groups to help marginalized populations obtain access to the measures included in Bill C-93. Well, bully for them, see? See what it's like to have a Senate that works? Yeah, put some stuff in there and make sure all the people who are most likely to have a conviction for this, that are not the most well-off in our society, make sure that they can get this shit done so it's not used against them. Bully. See you again. Let's take this opportunity. All you people that say abolish the Senate, you're nuts. Well, that's because the Senate now works, in my opinion. All I had left was C-100, which is the new bill to make NAFTA happen. The Mexican Senate passed it today. They're still playing games with it in Washington. There is talk that they want it done in Washington before their recess for the summer. I don't know if that's going to happen. If it does, that's when Parliament will get called back in July. It could even be August because we have a fixed campaign period and we have a fixed election date. So we know what the deadline is for getting the election writ in. And it's not until September. So we got lots of time. And that also is the out for the Liberal government with having to come back, quote unquote, for the new NAFTA vote and ratification. And if there's anything else hanging around, they can handle it. That might be a hole for C-262 if they really want to make this an election issue. It's not a bad idea. It's a huge subject. It's a huge everything if they want to do that. But, we'll see what happens. The paper's flying back and forth, up and down Wellington Ave, across the Rideau Canal. See what happens. Thanks for listening tonight. We'll see you next week on The View Up Here. Good night.